Hey guys, welcome to Ladies Night In. Go ahead, you know the drill, go get your glass of wine. I have mine. I'm drinking a red tonight, which makes me feel fancy. I figured this time around we would talk about the Penelopiad by Maragret Atwood. Most people know Maragret Atwood for her The Handmaid's Tale. She writes kind of speculative fiction and literary fiction and has been pretty big on the feminist scene for a very long time. In fact, when most people are getting into feminist or otherwise woman-oriented science fiction, they often start with her. Penelope originally appears in Homer's Odyssey, which is a Homeric epic poem. It is one of the most well-known epic poems, and it follows Odysseus, who goes off to war in the Iliad, spends 10 years at war, and then has to spend basically another 10 returning. He upsets the gods, specifically Poseidon, who then thwarts his attempts to get home. Penelope is his wife, who, when Odysseus leaves for war, has basically just about to give birth to their son Telemachus. And she is left alone in their kingdom and has to basically fend for herself for the entirety of the time that Odysseus is gone. Penelope is not a terribly big character in the Odyssey. Penelope isn't really mentioned except for in scenes where either Odysseus is home or his home life is being threatened. After a while, considering he's been gone for 20 years, people assume he died at sea, and they begin coming to pursue Penelope's hand in marriage, rather forcefully in some cases, taking advantage of the fact that the only man in her home is Telemachus, who is a teenager and not really able to fulfill the roles that his father would have filled. So, except for those cases, Penelope is by and large kind of ignored in the Odyssey. We can talk about the implications of Penelope's presence and the things that she does and whether or not it's particularly feminist in a different video. In fact, if you would like to, we can totally do that. But Maragret Atwood decided that she wanted to do a retelling essentially of the Odyssey, but from Penelope's perspective. In the introduction to the Penelopiad, Maragret Atwood puts it like this. In the Odyssey, Penelope, daughter of Icarius of Sparta and cousin of the beautiful Helen of Troy, is portrayed as the quintessential faithful wife, a woman known for her intelligence and constancy. In addition to weeping and praying for the return of Odysseus, she cleverly deceives the many suitors who are swarming around her palace, eating up Odysseus' estate in an attempt to force her to marry one of them. Not only does Penelope lead them on with false promises, she weaves a shroud that she unravels at night, delaying her marriage decision until its completion. Part of the Odyssey concerns her problems with her teenage son Telemachus, who is bent on asserting himself not only against the troublesome and dangerous suitors, but against his mother as well. The book draws to an end with the slaughter of the suitors by Odysseus and Telemachus, the hanging of the 12 maids who have been sleeping with the suitors, and the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope. But Homer's Odyssey is not the only version of the story. Mythic material was originally oral and also vocal. A myth would be told in one way in one place and quite differently in another. I've drawn on material other than the Odyssey, especially for the details of Penelope's parentage, her early life and marriage, and the scandalous rumors circulating about her. I've chosen to give the telling of the story to Penelope and to the 12 hanged maids. The maids form a chanting and singing chorus which focuses on two questions that must pose themselves after any close reading of the Odyssey. What led to the hanging of the maids, and what was Penelope really up to? The story as told in the Odyssey doesn't hold water. There are too many inconsistencies. I've always been haunted by the hanging maids, and in the Penelopiad, so is Penelope herself. The Penelopiad is a telling of the Odyssey and of Penelope's life from her point of view after she has died. So Penelope is actually telling us the story of her life post-mortem. So we get all of the really interesting stories from her point of view without having to worry about whether she's being influenced by her husband or her son, because they're not with her. In it, Atwood takes us through Penelope's life, starting from the very beginning, from her childhood and her father, who is kind of just a mess of a human, and takes us through her early years of marriage, what it was like to be married to a man who would have been Odysseus, and what it was like to have to fend for herself and for her household when Odysseus was gone. One of the really interesting things about this story is that Penelope is responsible for her entire household. And in the Odyssey, it's made very clear that this household does not just include Penelope and her son Telemachus. She's responsible for the maids, the servants, for the people who farm on her property. And when Odysseus doesn't come home, she has to defend them from suitors who don't have the estate's best interest in mind. It was very likely at the time that there would have been great chaos and, in fact, perhaps even deaths in the uproar of Penelope marrying another suitor. The Odyssey doesn't focus on the emotional and moral consequences of the decisions that Penelope was making. By and large, when it talks about it, it talks about the ways in which Odysseus can depend on Penelope, on how he made the right choice when he got married, and how it's his estate that is being threatened, as opposed to Penelope and her life. There is some verse in this story which is really interesting, and Atwood works to blend the story with verse in a kind of fairly fluid way. So you will see at the end of certain chapters or in the middle of a story, you'll get these kind of blocked off poetic tales, so to speak. When Atwood is doing this, she's actually talking from the point of view of the maids that were in the home. When Penelope is being pursued by her suitors, these men gather into her gates and she's unable to turn them away because of hospitality rules. There are certain assumptions about the way that she is supposed to host these men, about the way that she is supposed to interact with them, and of course that she is supposed to inevitably marry them. These are all a bunch of single bachelors with kind of crazy libidos and appetites who begin to take advantage of the fact that Penelope can't get them to leave. And one of the consequences of that is that they take advantage of Penelope's maids. In Homer's Odyssey, this is often shown as a kind of slutting it up moment, right? Atwood rethinks that by engaging concepts of imbalance of power and the kind of obligations that women had to men at the time that perhaps Homer was not being overly critical of because he supposedly lived then, or because it would have been the norm at the time that the Odyssey was being compiled. And most interestingly, not only does she rethink this kind of where to place the blame question, but she shows us that Penelope is in fact feeling very, very guilty. These girls would have been part of Penelope's home from the time that they were children, and so Penelope feels, one, very much like a mother figure to them, and also like she is the sole person responsible for their well-being. When she notices that they're being taken advantage of, she feels that the blame naturally falls upon her as opposed to upon the girls. I think this is a really interesting and nuanced way to start thinking about this story. And Atwood really does a good job of showing that side that we wouldn't normally think of when we think of the Odyssey. One of the really interesting parts of the Penelopiad is that because Penelope is in the underworld, or in the kind of after world that you would have, she's able to interact with people who had wronged her and is able to have conversations with those characters, interrogating them and their motives and why they would have behaved in those ways towards Penelope. She also gets to kind of have her say about how they have treated her badly. And I like that. It's not something that you often see characters getting to do even in a straightforward fiction sense. And so I like the way that Atwood takes advantage of the kind of unique ghostly situation of Penelope. The story also lets Penelope kind of be able to explain the way that she navigates her kind of economic situation, her responsibilities to her household, with the more personal aspect of how she wants to raise her son and how she's doing that without a clear father figure. Admittedly, this isn't my favorite Atwood story. I'm a big fan of The Handmaid's Tale, and I'm not the biggest fan of retellings. Just in general, they tend to not hit those boxes that I like to have checked. But this is an interesting think piece and a really engaging way to challenge our assumptions about a very classic story that doesn't do it in a hostile way, but allows a character who would not normally have a strong voice to rethink and challenge the way that she's being treated. So in a lot of ways, this story is very interesting and challenges a lot of the different ways that we would normally think about characters. It allows us an opportunity to really start thinking about the lives of characters we have not seen and what that might mean for these characters in the context of their situation, and how we would think about those situations now that our social mores have changed. If you have read the Penelopiad, let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts on it, especially because, like I said, it's not necessarily my favorite Atwood. If it's your favorite Atwood, I want to know that. Especially if you have a different kind of approach to retellings, I would love to hear that too. So that is it for Ladies' Night. I hope you are having a fantastic reading week. I'll talk to you later.